Hi, everybody. I'm talking today to Jonathan Tepper, who is the author of this book, Shooting Up, which is coming out. When is it coming out, Jonathan?
It's coming out next week.
Awesome. In the UK, it's published in the UK and in the US. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, I think they're off by a date, one day in terms of which day they come out.
And Jonathan is a chief investment officer at Privet Capital and has written some finance books, which I'm really not at all interested in. But I am interested in this memoir of his time as a missionary kid in Spain. Is it La Bas out
San Blas. San
San
Blas.
Blas,
Like,
sorry.
yeah.
I'm not a Spanish speaker, so
Okay.
as you can tell. San Blas in Madrid, where his parents were worked with addicts and really built an amazing, huge organization that rehabilitates addicts within a faith-based context. And so his story is about that experience growing up in the 80s and into the 90s at a time when AIDS was ravaging that community. So there's a lot of sadness in the book, but there's also a lot of meaning and joy as well in the book. And really very lovely story. I told I told you ahead of time that I probably had some reactions that the general public would not. So let me start there. Um, First of all, I think most people, whether they're from a secular or religious outlook, would probably describe your parents or think of your parents as sainted people. And you in the book specifically saying that they are not saints. But most of what you portray in the book would lend itself to that designation because they were, even by missionary standards, unusually self-sacrificial, unusually unusually uninterested in their own comfort, unusually dedicated and loving to people who were in dire circumstances and who were not really lovely at the beginning of their relationship. And was they were able to, you were all were able to establish some really beautiful relationships across a lot of divides. So in I think, you know, it would how you describe them, regardless of your pushback, I think most people would consider them as sort of sainted figures. But my reaction as a missionary kid and having spoken to missionary kids, I picked up on you had various passages in the book where you sort of expressed, I think from your childhood vantage point, some resentments about them. And those are the things that I picked up on. And you seem to relinquish those by the end of the book or sort of push back on your own resentments. But I confess I got very angry at your parents at various points in the book. So talk to me about their calling, and really what underlies my anger and a lot of MK anger is just how completely subsumed and consumed you and your brothers were underneath their calling, and how really you seem to me lower down in their priorities than the people they were ministering to. And one thing, sorry, I'm rambling on, but
Um,
one example that I just want to bring out, and then I'll hand it over to you to comment. Um, this addict Mahara, is that how you say his name?
yeah.
Who actually physically was harming you in the way he was teasing you and crushing your hand, and your parents were basically chastised you for being concerned and upset with him about that. And so yeah, so why don't
Well,
you
so I don't think they were upset that that I was upset. What they were upset is of like if we hit him back or something, So like we were
they
supposed to
seemed
show like turn the other
unconcerned
cheek, basically.
they seemed unconcerned that you might be harmed, and
Yeah. Well,
just
so
throughout they
it's
seemed unconcerned that you might be harmed.
So it's interesting. Your reaction is very similar to the reactions of friends of mine, like the mother of my closest friend, actually. She's not Christian or familiar with the missionary background, but she sent me a note and she said, "I started out the book being very, very angry at your parents, and by the end, she said I had this grudging admiration for them." And even speaking to like my mother's sister and her friends. They were all horrified that we were growing up around junkies, and the book starts with my brothers and me getting these pamphlets, which had our home address and number to have. We had like Friday night meetings, inviting the addicts and their families to our house or apartment, and then my parents would take the addicts to centers around Spain because there were almost none in Madrid at the time. And so, people are horrified that we were like talking to addicts as they shoot up, or when they're just milling about in the parks, uh, you know, killing time drinking beers or trying to find the next car to break into or things like that. And it is a very abnormal, unusual childhood. I never felt particularly unsafe, to be honest. We were just little blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys, and we didn't have money, we didn't have drugs, so like there was no reason why the addicts would have had any interest in us, beyond finding us to be something, an amusement or curiosity. Some of the addicts like Majara were a little brutish with us, but for us they really became dear friends and like older brothers, and many of them entered the center, got off heroin, and it was beautiful to see that change. The resentment I had, and I write more in the book, was really much more. And I think it's not specifically something that missionary kids have, but rather it's probably much more even preachers' kids in the United States, where you have this mission, or role that the entire family effectively signed up to, even if the kids don't agree to it, right? Like if you're, and I talk about it in the book, if your parents are engineers or lawyers or doctors, like, it doesn't matter one bit to your life, like you're not hanging out at the hospital talking to the relatives of the people getting an operation or something. If you are a missionary kid or a preacher's kid, like, you were being dragged along to all the services, you were being taken, on trips and then roped into whatever that mission is. And then particularly my parents were extremely sort of when they were poor anyway. Missionaries tend not to have much money, but the little money that did come at key points in time, they would give to the drug rehab center to help it grow. And so some years they didn't even have enough money to send us to the school in Madrid, which was Evangelical Christian Academy. And so we ended up becoming homeschooled, not out of any ideology or decision that my parents thought that was the best way forward, but they just didn't have money to send us to school. And I do remember they'd, it didn't have much money and were giving the little they had away.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if their behavior or the sort of the risk they took with you would be different if you were girls or if they had a girl, because I have really, I know anyway, in my circle, I have girls who's again in the context of missionaries, of missions or other ministry, basically put their children at risk, and their girls ended up being sexually abused and abused in other ways. So I wonder if that your parents would have changed their tactic if you were girls or not.
I'm fairly certain that they would have been behaved very differently if we were, young girls rather than young boys. I think they had a general attitude that, when we were never too far away from them, when we were handing out pamphlets or things like that. So it's not like they just sent us out and come back at the end of the day. We're generally within 50 to 100 feet of my father and mother. And then, it's obviously very different being a boy than a girl, just, almost anywhere, unfortunately, due to, the way many societies, treat women, unfortunately.
Yeah. Um, Next, I want to ask you about your sort of the interaction of your family with American evangelical culture. And you don't have much, you obviously you're back on furloughs in the book, but you don't really talk about that very much. And the impression the reader gets is that, your parents were sort of not divorced because they were obviously dependent on support, but that really didn't have anything to do with them, and they sort of kept to their own, what they were doing in their work and didn't sort of worry about that. But give me a little bit more background about, were they with a mission? Who was
Yes.
their supporter base and
Well,
who was
so
their
they
mission?
had been missionaries in Mexico for 4, maybe 5 years before they went to Spain. And my father started and mother started a church with university students in Mexico and Puebla. And my father and mother wanted to do the same thing in Spain. So go to Spain, work with university students. And as it turned out, university students in Europe had, and Madrid at the time, had very little interest, or no interest, in fact, in Christianity, or at least a sort of a Protestant version of such, even though almost everyone is nominally Catholic in Madrid. And they started helping the addicts in Madrid. But between going from Mexico to Spain, they'd been essentially independent missionaries, right? Like where they just felt called, and there were a couple of churches that sent them some money. And then they joined an actual mission before they went to Spain. So they joined. It used to be called a Worldwide Evangelization Crusade. It was started by C.T. Studd. And I don't know, I can't remember which year, but they changed the name. Obviously, the crusade has negative connotations, particularly in the Middle East, and rightly. And then they changed the name to Worldwide Evangelization for Christ. So they kept the initials, and it was WEC. And so the international headquarters used to be in Bulstrode outside of London. And then there's US headquarters which I think is still there, in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, near Valley Forge.
So solidly within like this evangelical American frame. So my question is, what I'm interested in particular on the AIDS front, because as we know, evangelicals still aren't terribly compassionate, or there's a lot of prejudice in evangelical circles about people who have AIDS and how they might have gotten it. Certainly the confluence with homosexuality, which is still like a taboo in evangelical circles. And I imagine in the 80s there was a lot of taboo about that. Did your parents feel like they had an opportunity or a mission to sort of teach the American Christians about their experiences? And were they able to do that, or was there any sort of pushback or risk there for them?
Uh, so I think my parents were very much focused on their work in Spain and didn't view that they had a role or like a mission to educate Americans. I think my parents had a newsletter they'd send out quarterly between these 4-year furlough visits back to the United States. And they would write about AIDS and about the work with the addicts. And then when they would go back on the furloughs, they would talk to churches about what they were doing. But the interaction with the United States was probably much more people coming to visit and see what my parents were doing, or via these newsletters. So there wasn't very much in terms of my parents trying to go back and educate Americans about what they should think or not about AIDS. They were very much focused on caring for the people, who were present in the drug rehab center in Madrid. And then obviously it started growing outside of Madrid.
But they never got sort of people threatening to pull their support or anything like that based on
Um,
their approach or their views of people.
No, not at all. No, I mean, I think most American churches were very positive and encouraging. I mean, my parents never had that much support, to be honest, which is why they never had that much money. And I think part of it was like my parents, went back and spoke to churches every 4 years, but it wasn't like their number one priority to go out and line up support or market themselves. And my father like wrote his letter and was put out into the mail, and that was it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That to me that is kind of emblematic. I think most missionaries in my experience seem to sort of, this is me and I'm doing my work, important work over here, and like, America's like has nothing to do with me. And I think that is actually problematic. I think one of the purposes of having, not to criticize your parents, because I think they probably were doing more of that than they intended to, teaching American Christians just by virtue of what their ministry was. But I feel like it's a missed discipleship for the American church, because every missionary I know, particularly in these times, they have all these thoughts and contacts and perspectives on what's going on, especially right now with Christian nationalism and the MAGA movement. But they won't say anything because it has nothing to do with them, but also because it risks their
Well,
support.
So, and obviously I can't speak for my parents, but I think in the early days of Battelle and the Drug Rehab Center, it was a small center and it started growing very quickly. And so um, the people who knew my parents knew my parents and got the letter. It was only with the passage of time that the center started growing, and then the center became a little bit better known, and more people started visiting. And then over the years, quite a lot of visitors would come through to see the drug rehab center, and so certainly there, I think people got a much better view and understanding of a lot of these issues.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, I was just curious about how, because your parents seem, based on I mean, there's a lot of differences between your experience and mine, or or the typical one that I'm familiar with. But one of them is, yeah, I mean, they were devout. They are, or your mother's passed away, unfortunately, but they were devoutly evangelical, but they seemed less dogmatic and more like the barriers between them and the people they were ministering to, they they had real relationships with people, and it wasn't a condescension that like they seemed to really form very deep, meaningful relationships
Yeah,
with
so
this.
I think the early addicts in the program, which were, and obviously I went off to college in 1994, so I don't know many of the later addicts who came in. I know, I were friendly with them, but I had a much closer relationship with the early ones. They really did become like older brothers and sisters to me and my brothers, and they are like family to this day. And obviously, many of them passed away. And the first
So
addict,
many. Oh,
Raul,
devastating.
he was, like an older brother to us. And so there were never others or different. They were Spanish, we were Americans. There's obviously in some cases like a very vast educational gap between us. My parents were sort of hyper literate, but they were we just absolutely loved them. And I think they loved us too.
Yeah. And you lived very much in that community. Like you weren't like living in a middle class neighborhood and then you come over to the community and do your work. Like you're very much living in the community and part of that community, which I think is makes a big difference. I mean, some could argue that it puts you in more danger. That's always the sort of back and forth with missionary kids, right? Um, Next I want to ask you about, so you hint in the book, um at various points that your faith diverged, or you had more doubts than say your parents, or you weren't quite buying the whole religious program that they were so um devoted to. Where did your faith end up?
Well, first of all, I'm not a pastor or a theologian, and what I set out to do with the book was to just really write a universal story of love and loss,
Right.
more than try to tell anyone what they should believe or
Right.
try to tell anyone what my own particular journey is, and hold that out as some sort of guidepost to others. So I've tended to try to stay away from the question in general. What I was writing about in the book it was really that and you reference it in your own book a little, but if you're preaching to people that Jesus went out and healed people and their miracles, but then almost all my friends around us were dying of AIDS, obviously it does create a bit of a, a question, and then certainly our family suffered loss and tragedy as well, and you do have the question of suffering in the world and how does that happen, and that certainly plays a role. And then you have just, I think, a lot, when you're a teenager and even beyond, you have a lot of the natural questions of like, as you start, reading through the Bible, which parts are teaching and allegorical, and which parts might be literal and things like that. And, so there's a lot of um, those kinds of questions too. And I think Christianity, has many very beautiful aspects to it. Not least the Sermon on the Mount. And I have a paragraph in the book, where I say that it was strange that so many Christians took the creation story and the genealogies very literally, but then viewed the Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments as being mere suggestions. And I think so. There is some of that as well. And then, I deeply admired my parents' Christianity, where they were trying to live out day to day, certain Sermon on the Mount, showing love and empathy to others, and then, within the Protestant community, almost anyone can declare themselves a minister, and and then if you buy an airplane ticket, that makes you an international minister. And so these people would sort of come through our home often, and my parents had a much higher tolerance for crackpots than I did, and so that comes out in the book too as well.
Yeah, a little bit. It's here and there. But I do think where one lands as a missionary kid in particular, where one sort of lands with their faith really it's hard to separate that out from how you then view one's parents when your entire life and identity and everything is so subsumed in this calling, which I mean, granted, your parents had, if you took religion completely out of it, their earthly legacy is quite phenomenal in terms of affecting so many lives and helping them and heal. But for many missionaries, even for your parents, I think evangelism was the ultimate goal, to get people to convert to Christ. So, uprooting your entire family and reorganize and basically subsuming your children and your entire family underneath this assumption that people will go to hell if they don't believe in Jesus. Whether or not you continue to hold to that or not, I don't think you can separate that out from how you view your childhood and your family, don't you think?
Um, I mean, possibly. It's not a question I've spent an enormous amount of time thinking about, to be honest. I tried to write a story of a very particular sort of time and place and my friends, and I didn't set out specifically to write a missionary kid story. Obviously, it's part of it. It's an element of the story. When I try to think of what I was writing, books that come to mind and that certainly were influences were like A Grief Observed or A Year of Magical Thinking with Joan Didion. And then obviously there's the AIDS epidemic, and there, books like Borrowed Time by Paul Manette and things like that. But uh, um, yeah, it is a missionary kid memoir to its core, but I didn't set out to try to address, all these questions that one might have for missionary kids.
Yeah. You have a paragraph here describing religion and being in a very all-consuming religious environment like the MK one is. Growing up in a religious home was like being a goldfish. The invisible walls of my family and beliefs had been my world. In the bowl, you think the water is all there and everything outside is blurry. Some drink and join, but to others, the fishbowl of religion will always be small and alien. Yeah, so that I feel like that described it really well. And I guess whether I don't know, I don't, I mean, if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. To me, like, I don't think you can talk about missions without, getting into matters of faith. But, whether you're in or still out of the fishbowl, to me, like, it has an impact, right?
No, of course. And maybe that's a subject for another book, or I don't think there's another memoir in me, by the way, but I'll have to go back to writing economics books. But no, the story I really set out to tell was a story of love and loss, and a story of the neighborhood and my friends. And the impetus for writing the book was I was working at a hedge fund in New York at the time, from like '04 to well, sorry, '03 to '05. But I found the book in 2004, and I read Flying Over 96th Street, a story of an East Harlem white boy, a memoir of an East Harlem white boy by Tom Weber. And it was about a preacher's kid whose family moved him to East Harlem. And, they were effectively missionaries within the United States, in the sense that they were, parents went to Harvard and but decided that the kid should grow up in a poor neighborhood helping people. And the mother ran a literacy program and the father ran a church. And so all his kids were black and Puerto Rican as he's growing up. And then, he would go off to collegiate and ended up going off to Harvard. So he had this sort of very schizophrenic intellectual life and social life in one place. And then, this for the mission. in East Harlem on the other. And when I read that, I just thought it was such a beautiful book and very evocative and elegiac towards his friends he had lost. And I just thought someone needs to do this about my friends in my neighborhood. And then I felt a kinship in terms of being a preacher's kid, and even that was like an internal mission within the United States and going from one community to another. And that was really why I set out to write the book. A lot of these sort of fleshing out the MK experience, and believe it or not, actually came much later in the editing process, where they were like, well, no American's going to want to read a story about AIDS and heroin in Spain. And it's like, so what's the American angle? And then furthermore, to actually draw the family well, in terms of characters and character arcs, you have to explore these tensions between, being a preacher's kid, missionary kid, and the resentments one might have towards one's parents, which like initially in the earlier drafts I had sort of left out because I thought might be interesting to me, but to who else? But actually, it's something that a lot of readers have pointed out and find to be among the more interesting parts because it's very relatable.
Yeah, see, I tried to write just a memoir, and they told me nobody care about me, and I needed to write it about American evangelicalism. So that's what I ended up doing. So it's kind of it's kind of a mirror image, I guess, of you're trying to avoid all that, and I'm trying to like go right into that because and they're telling you that that's yours is what they want to hear, and they're telling me that nobody cares
Well,
about.
I think the publishing industry is, I don't know what the right adjective is, but I think it's just terrible.
Oh,
In
it's
terms of,
horrible. And writers make like no money. I don't know why we do this except for narcissism.
well, it's funny. A friend of mine was getting his book published yesterday, and he texted. He said the only reason to do this, he said, is narcissism and spreading ideas.
Yeah,
But no,
which are intertwined.
yes. I mean, obviously there has to be an element of narcissism, I think. I hope as little as possible in the case of my book, but I genuinely did want to write a tribute to my family and my friends. But obviously, I think to write a memoir and to write a good memoir, you need three things. And some people have a story, but you have to also have the ability to tell the story, and which not everyone has, or at least not everyone develops that practice of learning to write. And then I think the probably third and even more important thing is it's like an ultra marathon. So you have to have the endurance to actually deal with the draft, the writing, the drafts, the editing, and then the whole publishing process.
Well, I think you have to absolutely love writing. I mean, that's the only reason I write is because I just can't not write, like I just have to. So there's that. And also narcissism. Speaking of narcissism, one of to me, when I grapple with the missionary story, the sort of any missionary story or any, I also have had friends who raised by sort of secular do-gooders, who have similar resentments and views of their parents and so on and so forth. I think, we as human beings, it's hard to do anything devoid of narcissism. Like we're all very self-centered. But I wonder if I can ask you just a philosophical question from your perspective and with these parents that you had. Like, what do you think the line is between narcissism and altruism? And there's a great Taylor Swift lyric. If you're you're probably not a Swiftie. She has a great
No.
lyric about that in one of her songs. But what's the line there when do-goodery? How much of it is narcissism and how much of it is altruism, and how can you tell the difference?
Uh, I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, and a psychologist might be better placed. But from my own experience or thinking about it, I would say that, you know, people who do have a mission, often feel that, they are special and that's why they're chosen. And so that's where the narcissistic element comes in. And then unfortunately, I think in the particularly evangelical circles, you do have ministries that are always have the person's name in the title, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, some
And
of it's obvious. Some of it's
that's like
just
a dead
obvious.
giveaway,
Yeah.
you know. And so, but I do think that when I look at my parents, I think my father very definitely was a visionary and some thought was a little crazy. And I think that when I'm in the investing world and I've started companies, and I think that a lot of secular founders, are somewhat narcissistic or a little crazy, and like there has been an element of craziness because if you're starting a company, statistically, most companies fail, right? Like most startups fail, and you have to have some element of believing that you're special, that your business is not going to fail, that it's the other people's business who's going to fail. So this sort of sense of self-belief is not just there in Christianity; it's there in other areas too. And so I think having this sort of mission and vision quite often does lead to people to you know, I think that they have that secret special sauce that's going to make them succeed. Um, and then when you look in the evangelical circles, I suspect that you do have this sense of calling. And in some cases, I think there's a humility about it, which is that people are trying to, make that calling happen. But in other cases, I do think that they might feel that God called them, not the person next to them in the pew, and that's why they're special. But those are just my theories.
Yeah. All right, let me ask you kind of another philosophical question that comes out through your relationships, your family's relationships with the addicts, but then also later, I was really struck by you talking about your transition back to the United States. And of course, there's a lot of good MK um, content in there about you talk about how you felt you never felt in Spain you were proudly American, and then when American you never felt more Spanish. That really related, and you felt sort of half this, half that, never quite either one. You also talk about sort of the compartmented life that you led in Spain with you're in this evangelical school, and then yet that seemed divorced from your other life of in and out of these clinics and in that sort of ministry, which to me I sort of took as indicative of your parents' ministry and your lives as being less of unusual for the missionary life, because in my experience, they usually do sort of create their own little bubbles wherever they go. But then you have something you're talking about your struggles when you come back to to college, and you to make any friends, and you sort of, which I did the same thing, where you sort of just consume yourself with your academics because that was what was easier and more comforting for you, and relating to people who you felt such a vast divide from, um, felt you know, not as satisfying. So you didn't put much effort in there. And then you're talking about you say what of that, and then you're looking back on your younger self and sort of bemoaning your attitude at that time. And you say what a vast gap between knowledge and wisdom. I was no more responsible for my odd schizophrenic childhood than they were, these American kids in college, for their normal ones. Yet I placed the burden on them to understand me. And I was like, whoa, that's exactly what I did, in as a young person. And I think that's what a lot of people who are lonely, I mean, obviously there's lots of reasons why people might be lonely, but a lot of people who feel lonely, I think that's what we often do. And so I wonder if you can connect sort of that experience of failing to cross a divide back to your experience in the with the addict community, where your family and you personally successfully crossed a huge divide to form meaningful relationships. What insight do you have on how to do that? Especially I find it frustrating across socioeconomic divides or educational divides. Like when I do charity work, which I hate to even call it that around here, and I'm a pretty affluent person here in the DC area, and when I go out, let's say, and volunteer in a homeless shelter, I'm really conscious of like the divide between us and not wanting to condescend. And the fact that just my being there, I've sort of put myself in the superior position. How do you form like mutual, how do you get mutuality and real relationship across big divides like that?
I mean, it's a very big question with a lot of different sort of angles that you've asked. But very broadly, and it's not, I don't think I've had this insight earlier in life, but as I was like writing the book and thinking about it, and then became a father 2 years ago and thinking about my own son, and um, I think I think in life you get what you give, right? So if you give love to other people and you show genuine curiosity about them, you generally will get the same back. And I think that in the case of, for example, my parents with the addicts, if you're showing love and you have a genuine interest in sort of who they are and what their need is, people feel that and sense that. And if you don't, then, you won't get that back. And I think that, it's like animals. If you mistreat a dog and treat it cruelly, you'll probably end up with a pretty vicious dog or one that sort of cowers. And if you treat it with great love, you'll get a lot of love back. And I think that with the way that going back to the university, if I displayed very little interest in them or trying to even understand them, well, I wouldn't get much interest in my own story back, right? And I think that that was, is one of the problems in life, which is that, and even in missions, there was an early review of my book, and he said that one of the problems with the Christian church, and is written by a Christian in the church in the U.S., is that the idea of mission is that the needy will come to the church and figure out what their problem is, right? And whereas in fact, sort of missions is about going to be where people are and meeting them. And I think that, it's, me failing to trying to get to know the students around me at Chapel Hill. But I think some of my sort of social difficulties at Chapel Hill, or lack of taking better advantage and forming better friendships there, in part wasn't just being a missionary kid or being a third culture kid, which is obviously what your book and what a lot of this conversation is about. I think it related much more specifically to, almost all my friends were dying of AIDS at the time. The peak in death in Spain was 1994, 95. And then in 95, the highly active antiretroviral therapy came out, and people were still dying in 95, 96, but it was clearly, as the drugs got distributed, the desk collapsed. And so I went to college basically feeling very distant and unable to go back and see my friends. And many of them died before I was able to go back and see them. And so I also just thought, like, it's not something that, like, if you sit in a coffee shop and try to explain to someone, what you've gone through. And I went off to college basically 3 years, after we had a loss in my own family. I think the grief element, even possibly more than the cultural element, was one that kept me
Mm.
from relating to other people.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of grief in the MK transition though as well. You really lose a big part of yourself. That was one of the universal themes that came up in my research. You mentioned the loss in your family. Of course, one of the real pivotal points in the book is when your little brother was killed in a car accident. Ironically, in the United States, because a lot of as you're reading along in the book, you're focused on, as a reader, you're focused on the sort of dangers that your parents have put you in, and then it turns out that they did lose a child, but it was in the US on just a normal US road trip. Although I just felt your brother who was driving, I just was devastated for him. I can't imagine your teen brother who was driving the car and was a new driver. What a devastation that must have been for him to be the one that and feeling responsible for that, as well as your dad. You talk about that. Um, and I think it becomes clear in the book, particularly with your mother, um, that this grief that you all experienced really deepened your relationships with the people that you're working with, and sort of whatever remained of the divide between you sort of washed away in your mutual understanding of grief. And there's a particularly poignant part in the book where your mother just sort of gets up in front of the congregation and basically says, I haven't been able, basically just lays it all bare about like I haven't had anybody over to the house because I can't function. Like I'm not functioning, I can't, you know, and to me that's a key part of the of because you can sort of dispense love and you can have love. Most of what I grew up with was love along a hierarchy where like my parents who were beloved, but they were dispensing love, they were dropping, goodies down, and then people deferred to them and looked up to them, and there wasn't a lot of, I didn't witness a lot of mutuality. There's a very different quality to a mutual love than a sort of, you know, hierarchical sort of love that's in a lot of charity, I think. And I thought your parents were even before this death of your brother, really exhibited that mutuality, but then in their vulnerability, and particularly your mother's vulnerability and your own vulnerability, I felt like that was kind of the real that a big step towards further mutuality.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think my brother's death may let us know that or experience the experience of many of the families in San Blas. And many had lost sons and daughters to overdoses, and then to AIDS. And so it was, and then my parents, could have easily packed up and gone back to the United States. They didn't do that. And so I think they realized that, we were all in it together and we were all alike. We're all human and everyone can suffer loss. No one's spared that. Missionaries certainly aren't spared that. And I think that it created a much more love and empathy. And in the book, I talk about there was a little AIDS conference just so people could get more information and talk about their own experience. And some doctors and others there. But Raul, the first addict in the center who was HIV positive, said AIDS has been positive, and it was sort of a very shocking statement to say. But what he meant by that was that to him it brought about more love and empathy for others. And when men and women enter the drug center and were HIV positive or suffering from AIDS, he was just like them. And so I think the loss of my brother was very much the same, which is that we all experience loss, and we're all fundamentally human at the end of the day, and no one's spared from sickness and disease and death.
Yeah. So much you experience so much grief and so much death at a young age. I mean, it's just the the number of deaths of in the AIDS crisis is just like, I mean, it's basically the entire community at that point before the ARVs come online. And yeah, I don't know, like I even as a 50-year-old, I've been relatively shielded from death. I've lost, a couple of people very close to me, my grandparents, but they were very elderly. That's a different sort of thing. And I just don't know how I mean, you describe it in the book very well, but as a young person, like coming to terms with that at a young age, do you think grappling with death and mortality so young, I mean, is that why you were so driven? Is that it seems to be like it made you cognizant of, how precious life is or the consequences, you better make it count sort of thing. Do you think that was part of why you were so driven? You went on, by the way, I should say, to be a Rhodes Scholar, and obviously a very accomplished person. But
Oh, thank you. I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to channel your um, uh, drive, your energy, your attention somewhere. And I think that and everyone deals with it in a different way. And in the epilogue, in a paragraph, I talk about uh, suffering, and it was my literary agent and then editor asked me to include it because I just thought I'll tell the story and readers will draw their own conclusions. But they were like, well, why don't you sort of try to provide some thoughts on sort of on this question? And I wrote that suffering itself is meaningless. It's our response to it that gives it meaning. And you can either harden your heart and become uninterested in others, or you can become more loving and have more love and empathy. And I think the answer to suffering, as my mother said, and I repeat in the book, is the answer to suffering is always more love. And trying to love those who are currently hurting and suffering. And then when we think of those who've passed, we can treasure them and their memory. And I love the expression of Jewish tradition, obviously, when someone passes, which is that may their memory be a blessing. And I do hope that the book, that the memory of my friends, is a blessing. And I feel that a lot of the early readers and some of the critics have said that they felt that they knew Raoul or my brother when they get to the end of the book. And if that's the case, then I feel I've done my job.
Yeah, and also allowing people to love you in your suffering. That's also something, that's a decision as well. You can close yourself off and you cannot let others near yourself. And that's also, you know, I think your parents obviously did not do that in their suffering. And it really seemed to enrich their relationships. So it is it's gut-wrenching, but it is beautiful to read, and it's really a lovely book. I wanted to
Thank you.
ask about your sort of current, you trace it through. By the way, how did all three of you and your brothers graduate from Oxford on the same day? Like, were they also Rhodes Scholars? How did that
No, so
happen?
they went to Oxford after me. So in Oxford, has many quirks about it, and one of them is like generally students will finish their final exams or deliver their dissertation, and then you can basically get a piece of paper saying that you've got your degree. But the ceremony itself is one that you have to sign up to, and because the ceremony takes place in the Sheldonian Theater, which is so it is very beautiful but relatively small theater built by Sir Christopher Wren. They do like rolling graduations to get the students in. And so you could like sign up for graduation a couple years after you finished, right? So it's
Oh,
not like you do it the year you finish. And I had
okay.
never bothered to even sign up for my graduation.
Oh, okay.
And so my brothers then went after me. And then I realized, wait a second, we can all pick the same day. And so we all signed up to the ceremony.
That's so
And
amazing.
yeah. And
That's so great.
also another reason to do it we figured out was if you graduate, like because it's such a small theater, you get two tickets. And so the only way, like basically if I graduated, like my two
Right, right,
parents,
right. Yeah.
that's it. So we figured if we all did it on the same day, we could get six tickets.
Yeah, yeah.
And that way, like my brother's wives could come, my parents could come, an aunt could come. And so that's what we did.
Oh, you gamed the system there. Were they Rhodes Scholars as well? Like, how is
No.
that? Okay.
No,
They
they
just
they
went
went
by
and
other.
studied. Yeah, they applied directly, and then both of them ended up studying theology. My younger brother, he pastors a church in Florida, and then my older brother David, he, believe it or not, I think he studied theology out of interest because his background was in mathematics and then accounting, and he works with me in private capital investing. So.
Okay, so let's talk about that because pardon me from observing that working as an investment banker is about as far away from being a missionary an impoverished missionary working with addicts as you could possibly get. How does that square with you in turn and your maybe your parents too, in terms of the values that they taught you? And also, is there any guilt? Like you're in kind of a world of wealth and they voluntarily took on a life of poverty. How do you sort of square that circle?
Yeah, so first is background, and it does come out a bit in the book, but my father studied economics at Cambridge, and then he got his MBA at Harvard, and then he had a religious experience. So growing up, and then my father at the dinner table would always have like a napkin, or he'd like have his steel fountain pen and draw economic diagrams or accounting relationships and things like that. And so my early years were basically learning about exchange rates and things like that. And I just thought it was absolutely fascinating, not least because when you're a missionary, like the churches are sending you dollars and then you're getting them in whatever that local currency is, and or spending it certainly in the local currency, even if you've got a dollar bank account. And in the 80s, you had the Plaza Accords, and the dollar lost half its value against the peseta from 85 to 87. So I became very interested in like what these exchange rate markets, which were terrifying, given that they could cut your income in half overnight. What were they? And so I just my brother, when he went to college, sent me his economics textbooks, and I studied them on my own, and took advanced placement tests to skip my first year of economics in college. I ended up writing an honors thesis on optimal currency area theory. So I've always loved economics, and then once I finished at Oxford, ended up going into investing and worked at a hedge fund. But I don't think one, I find it intellectually fascinating, and it's you're like analyzing companies and industries. But I don't think that there's a fundamental disconnect. I think if you could be a miserable, greedy person with little money, or you could be a miserable, greedy person with a lot of money. The question is, one, what kind of person do you want to be? And I know, just some phenomenal fund managers who are very humble, stay out of the news, give a lot of money away. And I know others, who are very attention seeking and don't give any money away. So, and I know people without much money who fit both categories, right? So it's how do you want to live your life, and where do you want to spend your time and your money? And I certainly have tried to be as involved as possible in my parents' drug rehab center, donating, certainly with the next generation, trying to help pay for schooling and university for many of the kids. And certainly, but as you and I just talked about earlier, you don't get into publishing for money,
No, not at all.
and so I don't think this book necessarily will do well. There's obviously the outside chance that, it could be the next Angela's Ashes. I doubt it, but um, if it does well, I'll be giving money away to the drug rehab center, and I hope my fund does very well. My parents encouraged me to pursue investing and starting companies. And ultimately, the reason my parents could stay on the mission field for so many years, helping other people, was that the drug center didn't give them a salary. It was churches and donors in the United States. And my parents obviously chose to give a lot of that to the drug center, but without someone actually working in the real world making money, a lot of charities can't survive. So that's how I view it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Lastly, you mentioned that you are a dad. And I wonder how, for me, becoming a parent really affected how I viewed my childhood and the decisions my parents made. Um, and I wonder if becoming a parent had any sort of impacted your how you process your own childhood.
Um, I mean, probably not yet. He's pretty young. I certainly like I only speak to him in Spanish. My wife speaks to him in English. I want to make sure that he's fully bilingual. And but one thing I realized is that, and it comes out in a paragraph in the book, um, where I talk about like, you can never really go home. Like I think home is a state of mind. It's a state of innocence. But beyond that, the world changes. And so, like one of my mentors, he's a retired fund manager, but like we both love photography, and we are talking about the photos of Saul Leiter, and he took these beautiful color photos of Manhattan in the 1950s, and that was like the world my friend grew up in. And we were talking about how that world's gone, in many ways, and the world I grew up in, San Blas, is gone. And what I realized is like your children will never have the experience that you had in life. Now, maybe in some small towns or something, like the world doesn't change all that much over time, but really, like we're in a stream that's constantly flowing. And I think my son is I can't try to give him the life I had, and I can't try to force it on him, and I can't even just in terms of cross-cultural experiences or educational or charitable or working with the poor or anything like that. Like he's going to be his own little person, and all I can do is try to encourage the curiosity along the way.
Would you when he's 7 years old, would you have him handing out tracts to addicts?
My wife is adamant that the answer is no. I'm actually think it worked out okay for me, so I'm open to it, but I think she would veto it.
Good. She's a good lady. I could tell. So it's good. It's good when those of us who had crazy upbringings, it's good to have some tied to somebody who's normal, as I call. They bring a different perspective to the situation. My husband was born and raised in the same town and had just a very normal childhood. And it's a good check on me, where I think like, oh, I'm doing great because I didn't send my tiny children to boarding school. So therefore, why do I need to help them with their homework? And he's like,
Well,
well,
one thing that, and I know that our interview will end very soon in the next few minutes, but one thing that didn't that I thought came up in your book, and I think why our experiences are very different, or in some missionary kids' experiences are very different to others. Sorry, because you just mentioned boarding school. It's a book I highly recommend to readers, and it was recommended to me by an investor in my fund who is a British aristocrat. His parents sent him off to boarding school at a very young age, and which is like the thing to do, obviously, if you're upper class
yeah,
and British, but it was one that the missionaries adopted as well. And the book, it's called Stiff Upper Lip. And it's basically about the trauma of being separated from your parents at a young age. And so I think
yeah.
some of the missionary kid issues are beyond being a missionary kid. It's much more tied to this sort of trauma of separation, that still happens in many places.
Yeah, it's gone out of style a little bit more, but it's still, it still happens and it still is an impact. But there's a wide variety of missionary kid trauma, I've news. So, but the ones that don't go to boarding school seem just as sort of traumatized. I didn't read that book, but I did read Joy Schifrin's Boarding School Syndrome, which apparently is that's a sociological thing, much discussed, I think, in Britain in a way that it's not at all here in America. But she just passed away actually, and she was kind of the leading expert on boarding school syndrome. So I'm sure that book is probably, but I haven't read that one. There's probably some similarities there. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate you talking to me. The book
I really
is
enjoyed it.
shooting up. It comes out next week in the US, and unlike me, you have like a pretty major publisher and you have some very impressive endorsements. So it'll probably do well, I think. Um,
Oh, thank you. I hope so.
but it is a straight memoir. It's not like my book at all. And it's very moving as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Holly. Absolute pleasure chatting.
Okay, let me turn this off, and I just want to say